Ja, schönen guten Tag, ja, liebe Freunde. Schön, dass ihr heute Abend gekommen seid. Ich möchte den Referenten ankündigen, Diplomphysiker Heinz Pommer, der aus Deutschland gekommen ist, um hier einen neuen Gesichtspunkt zum Thema 9/11 zu bringen. Er hat sich da jahrelang reingekniet und die Puzzlesteine zusammengetragen und möchte das heute mal vortragen, was er herausgefunden hat. Ja, bitte grüßen, Heinz.
Thank you very much. Still a few words about myself. As you have already heard, I am a physicist, but I am earning my money by writing technical documentation. This means my job is to collect information inside an enterprise, information describing complex machinery as generators, and to simplify this information, to structure it into small pieces so that it becomes easily understandable. In short, I'm doing instruction manuals. In respect to 9/11, I have been researching this topic for 5 years. To begin with, I was in the fortunate situation not to see the pictures of 9/11 until September 12. Indeed, my cousin phoned me on that day and told me that the World Trade Center had completely collapsed. But I decided to wait one day before looking at the event to guard my distance. So, the next day, I already had a clear picture in my mind of what to expect. So, expecting the tower's top toppling over and falling down, or seeing the tower splitting into two parts, leaving a gaping fissure in the middle. Anyway, I thought a third of the tower must still be standing. The pictures, however, did in no way correspond to these expectations. Of course, what remains in a state of shock, seeing these pictures, seeing the suffering of the people. But at the same time, the stupidity of the explanations provoked in me a deep fatigue, a sort of tiredness, and I told myself, I don't want to have anything to do with this. That's not my job. I leave this to the architects and engineers. That's their field of business. Please don't bother me with this topic. Well,
the South Tower was the first to fall. The Marriott Vista Hotel was crushed. A half an hour later, the North Tower collapsed. World Trade Centers 4, 5, and 6 were left standing but damaged beyond repair. World Trade Center 7 fell after burning for 7 hours.
Well, then 10 years passed by. And one evening, by chance, surfing on the internet and watching some clips on YouTube, I found a story from author Sophia Smallstorm, 9/11 Mysteries, Demolitions. And I was surprised to see how much information was actually available. In a certain way, I was even amused to see how rich the information pool was. An information pool created by individual persons. People like you and me collected all this without the help of a government institution or organization. And as a result, I started to get acquainted with this information, studying it in my spare time and to structure it in a sort of checklist. After all, that's my job. That's how I'm writing technical documentation.
So much to be explained. Why did the South Tower fall first when it was the second tower to be hit? Watch the top of Tower 2 leaning outward, about to topple. Then, suddenly, it disintegrates in midair. What causes this giant slab of steel and concrete to turn into dust before our eyes? Watch both buildings collapsing straight down, directly into the path of most resistance, which is all the floors and all the mass of the building itself. The World Trade Center towers came down in approximately 10 seconds. Seismic data from Columbia University puts the North Tower collapse at about 8 seconds and the South Tower at approximately 10. Here, the South Tower is half its original height, but wreckage from the upper collapse has not yet fallen this far. We are watching a demolition moving faster than gravity itself, a building bursting into powder from top to bottom. Here, the core of the North Tower finally gives up. 700 remaining feet of giant steel columns, among the strongest ever erected. What force acts upon the core to make it all of a sudden disappear? This is a pancake collapse. Why don't we see piles of floors at ground zero? And paper blown everywhere. Wouldn't a pancake collapse have trapped the contents inside? What blew this paper all over New York? What happened at the base of the towers just before they came down? Smoke appeared at street level. Watch the camera shake on its tripod as a large energy source rocks the ground. 9 seconds later, the North Tower falls.
Engineers are not just focusing on the Twin Towers. The most disturbing structural event was not that the Twin Towers fell, but that Tower 7, ignited by flying debris, fell due to fire alone.
So I structured and summarized the claims and findings of Sophia Smallstorm and the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. And I told myself, how can we recognize a classical controlled demolition? The propagation of dust clouds is only horizontally in case of a classical controlled demolition. But on 9/11 they vertically rose up to 1,500 meters. Normally, dust clouds are cold when a building is brought down, but on 9/11 people got burned. Normally, you can hear loud explosions clearly, but in this case we had a small earthquake 10 seconds before the collapse, and then you heard a deep roar, a bass howl. You have the destruction at the building's base, but in this case it stood firmly while disintegrating on top. And then the entire structure disintegrated in a huge fountain. Normally, you see a quite big heap of rubble, but in case of building 7 we observed a sunken-in debris field, and in case of the towers, debris was scattered in a wide area around them, whereby most of the building disintegrated into small chunks. Normally, objects around the building do not inflame, and in this case, on 9/11, cars went up in flames up to a distance of 800 meters. And one factor which becomes more and more obvious, the strange diseases developing nowadays. In case of classical controlled demolition, there are no health issues, but in the meantime, more than 72,000 people need medical care due to 9/11. Finally, we observe a strange and extreme cruelty of the state, indeed despising the citizens and the first responders by declaring the toxic air officially safe to breathe.
Before I continue to terrify people, we know that the Chinese symbol for crisis is the same symbol they use for opportunity. Has anyone heard that? So here's a first responder.
When people wake up, what are they going to discover?
They're going to discover they're being lied to. Mm-hmm. They're going to discover that all that glitters is not gold. They're going to discover that the Joneses don't exist. You're fighting a war to keep up with yourself. They're going to discover that experiments are made on people without their knowledge because they're prisoners. They're going to find out that only some people get to have the pie and some people don't. They're going to find out the middle class is being dissolved and it's becoming a clash between the haves and the have-nots. They're going to find out that the police job is not to protect us, but to protect the government from us. They're going to find out that not only have things like 9/11 happened with knowledge prior and after, and they ushered out the families of some of the perpetrators the very next day when all flights in the country were shut down. They're going to find out that the presidents, that leaders like Martin Luther King were assassinated, like Robert Kennedy were assassinated. They're going to find out that peace is not possible when you have a military-industrial complex. They're going to find out that war is still the biggest game, still the most profitable, and still the one that they always fall back on when the money gets gone. They're going to find out that our dollar is not worth anything. They're going to find out that Fort Knox doesn't have any gold in it. They're going to find out that we're in trouble. They're going to find out that gun control means hitting your target, not taking your guns away. They're going to find out that Adolf Hitler and Stalin thought that gun control was a great idea also. They're going to find out that when people are armed with the truth and with a way of defending themselves, that tyranny is impossible. They're going to find out that there's a lot more heart in them than they thought. They're going to find out that they're beautiful people. They're going to find out that there's a real reason for living. Hope. The pursuit of happiness. The ability to express yourself. And so many more things that we take for granted and believe that our government is working for.
That was Matthew Tartaglia. He was a FEMA search and rescue debriefer who spent 10 weeks at Ground Zero and basically whose life is shredding because of it. There are 40,000 people who showed up that day, 20,000 of whom have already been diagnosed with something called RADS, reactive airway dystrophy syndrome. They are unable to breathe, they are unable to work, and they are getting the shaft from the state, from the federal government. And the most recent ruling in New York was that if a rescue worker could prove that this happened to him on day one, 9/11, not 9/12 or 9/13, then they might get some help. But there was John Field is famous for setting up the Feel Good Foundation. He was on the site when a crane carrying a big steel beam swung by and clipped his foot. He's had 8 surgeries, and they have told him that, when did this happen? And he said, he gave the date, it was about 3 days after 9/11. They said, oh, well, 72 hours after the terror attack doesn't qualify as the terror attack. So, sorry, we can't help you.
Well, this is our first attempt to structure the information showing that there seems to be more behind 9/11 than just a classical controlled demolition. Still, one point, this is a shot taken from a helicopter that day. You can clearly see that the dust clouds are hot. At first, a small knob forms over the North Tower, and a symmetrical ring of dust clouds can be seen. And then this ring of dust clouds rises steadily, with the knob standing inside the ring, and it rises within 1 minute to a height of approximately 500 to 800 meters, so that the former knob is no longer visible. Well, this is a first comparison. And then there were, let us say, some curiosities, which I would like to show you shortly for the south and respectively also for the North Tower. So just a few clicks to begin with. We have the South Tower's top, toppling over and starting to rotate in free fall. Suddenly it stabilizes as if hitting a stopping bolt, continues free fall and dissolves. The disappearance of angular momentum during free fall while being dissolved at the same time is something which cannot happen. Then you have the white fumes escaping at the building's base, a sort of fine mist which is rising from below while the building itself is boiling over, mushrooming on top. At the South Tower's facade you have the very well documented steam explosions, which you all know. You have the eruptive destruction pattern, thus the ejection of material, while at the same time you find still standing structures of the building's core. You have the formation of different sections inside the dust cloud, meaning you have a very interesting cloud in different shapes and forms. You see a pitch black cloud of iron or steel dust. Smoothly distributed metallic dust simply appears as black, and you see a white cloud respectively, showing the characteristics of a fountain. In addition to the fountain, you have a firmly standing cloud stem. When using the word fountain, I mean, you see, many people say in this case the building would have burst at its base. When you observe a water spout fountain in nature, you see that nothing bursts at its base. When the water jet exits the nozzle, the energy of the material, of the water in this case, is sufficiently high to counter gravity by its directional kinetic energy and momentum. And this is exactly what we observe in case of the South Tower. We had eruptions of steam and gases from underground, meaning that even before the main cloud was rolling over and through the streets, you had these eruptions from underground nearly at the same time. And this is an example. The cloud will grow significantly in size. You see it rising before the main dust cloud. This is the same shot, taken from another position. And yet again, that's the same steam eruption from below, which will grow very, very rapidly, mixing with the black iron cloud showing here. So white is mixing with black. This means you have highly energetic phenomena underground. And finally you have the formation of still standing structures, which will remain from the building noticeable near the base. Normally you have a complete destruction at the base, and in this case structures are still standing partly in big pieces. The same applies also for the North Tower. Just clicking through the information, we have residual findings of thermite. You see the mushrooming on top and the escaping fumes at the building's base, while the building is cooking over on top, so to speak. We have the steam explosions at the building's facade. These you know very well, as they are shown quite often. You have the eruptive destruction pattern, meaning the ejection of material. Clearly visible here is the formation of a parabola. And you have the formation of different sections inside the dust cloud, also in the case of North Tower. The black iron cloud centered in the middle. You have the fountain and a standing cloud stem. Here in comparison to a nuclear experiment, usually right over the cauldron, hot many thousand degrees, a standing cloud is developing. The stem formation is clearly visible in case of the North Tower and stable for quite some time. You have pressure equalization and powerful currents of upwinds. In the beginning I found this difficult to understand. There were in fact survivors inside the North Tower, and even a person who survived a free fall from this position downwards, just because the whole object was acting like a wind tunnel. So he dropped several floors inside this wind tunnel, which means that the upwinds had at least a speed of 150 kilometers per hour, which is needed to have a person floating on the resulting air cushion. And the firefighter in the protected pocket at the base said he had to crouch down into a corner in order to prevent being lifted upwards, stating that his helmet started to fly off his head.
Do you have any sense for how you fell from the 22nd floor, which is the way you've identified it? You landed on a rubble that most people think was about 7 stories high. Right. So we're talking about a 15-story free fall on theoretically a piece of concrete. That's why they call you the 9/11 surfer. There are people in this documentary, as the viewers will see tonight, MIT physicists who explain perhaps what might have happened, a hurricane-force wind that almost lifted you up and allowed you to float down. Do you remember at all what it felt like? Do you have any idea of how you might have survived that fall?
I remember everything. I remember the fall. Every moment of that fall I remember. So I experienced it, and I think it's how I've been describing it that I guess the experts were able to come up with that theory. I always wondered myself, so I guess it makes sense.
I heard this very, very loud noise above me. It was just a tremendous roar. And then the wind, a very, very fierce wind, and my health, it started lifting me up off the ground. And so that's when I crouched down. The next thing I just crouched down. I got to the corner of the staircase by the railing, and I just got as small as I could possibly get.
And at last you have the famous spire, which is the still standing structure, which you see here. The spire is the still standing structure, visible for both towers, which was especially pronounced for the North Tower. Here you can see the collapsing North Tower. In a few seconds you will see the formation of the spire.
Oh my God.
Well, here it is. These are the remains of the tower. It will stand for 10 seconds. It also will crumble down. In addition, you can also see the central cloud and ring of dust, which started to rise shortly after. Well, at this point, I already thought this is rather interesting, because something about it seemed a bit odd. And entirely supposing that all this is just a simple classical controlled demolition, well, it didn't look that way. And nonetheless, I did not believe in a nuclear component. I just decided to let things rest for a few weeks and started to browse for some material containing political information on the internet. And between other stories, I found a statement of former CIA agent Mrs. Susan Lindauer. And I was listening to her after work. You know how things are, still sitting at a computer in the evening, listening to some alternative media information. And what she was talking about seemed to be in accordance with the average knowledge, with the accepted news and information. She was talking about Iraq, about the sanctions, about the children dying because of the sanctions. But suddenly she was saying something which did not fit the accepted frame of information to such an extent that I decided she must have gone mad. And I switched the channel. But after a while, I returned to this information channel to re-listen. Actually, she said she had received a personal warning from her superior, Richard Fues, to absolutely avoid a trip to New York at all costs, as they were expecting the use of a thermonuclear device in the city. He warned her of radiation contamination.
And Richard Fues said to me, "My God, what if there is no FBI director when this happens?" I said, "Do you think it's that soon? Do you think the attack is imminent?" He said, "Oh yeah." He said, "It's absolutely just in the next couple of weeks." He said, "I don't want," and I said, "Well, God, Richard, I'll go back to New York right now and I'll pump the Iraqis and see if they've got anything from Baghdad. I'll see if they have any news for us." And he said, "Oh my God, Susan, do not go back to New York City. It's too dangerous. We are expecting the use of a miniature thermonuclear device." And they were not afraid that I was going to be hurt by falling debris in the World Trade Center. I wasn't going to be at the World Trade Center. They were afraid of radiation contamination, like the winds blowing the radioactive stuff. And that's what he was like, "Don't go up there. We're expecting mass casualties."
After a while, however, I stumbled over another story on YouTube as well. Unfortunately, I cannot name the source for this clip anymore. Finally, it will depend on historians like Daniele Ganser to prove this story correct or false. A politician came out with the information that I had a visit from an American general in Brussels, who told them in respect to the formation of the Coalition of the Willing. You must join us. The situation is much worse than you think. Osama bin Laden is in possession of about 15 small nuclear weapons. He's ready to use them, and if you don't join us, there's a real danger that nuclear mushroom clouds will rise over European cities. The politician in his interview continued. After these words, the American general showed us a video where we watched in horror and disbelief how a gigantic mushroom cloud rose over New York. We asked after the presentation if we could make this video available to the public, and the general denied our question. This was classified information. For me, this was also a strange sort of news. I was thinking to myself, what is talking about? For I had never heard anything about a giant mushroom cloud in relation to 9/11 rising over some part of the city of New York. And then I started my research, searching this mushroom cloud only. I dropped everything else and concentrated on searching for this mushroom cloud. I was thinking to myself, it can't be number 1, it can't be number 2, consequently it belongs to building 7. But building 7 collapses into a heap of rubble. Period. Then a few weeks passed by, and suddenly I found it. Really, I was so amazed I watched the clip over and over again. The rising mushroom cloud over building 7. Actually, the news anchor who was commenting the event compared it to a volcano eruption.
And watching all day, this is like watching the collapse of an active volcano. And the dust from it is not unlike that from a volcano. We are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant David Restuccio. Lieutenant, where are you right now?
I'm at the corner of Northmore Street and Greenwich Street.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down. I would imagine it came down on its own.
Well, the total height is approximately 1.5 kilometers. This small tower here is 300 meters high. On this basis, you can estimate the overall height of the mushroom cloud over New York. This was building 7. No, you have to search quite a long time. I found only 5 shots of this mushroom cloud. Most of them are taken directly from below. I made them available on our website. They are referenced and available. The cloud shows some unique characteristics if you look carefully. It has a funnel, a so-called vortex. It shows several sections or steps in height, and after the funnel it has in addition an extra bulb on top. This means that you have strong friction and induced rotation phenomena between the cool and hot masses of air. In addition, if the first layer of cold air is reached, and the energetic center from below pushes with a hot sting of hot air through this cold layer, then you will observe that out of the already cold masses of the cloud a new funnel emerges. This is the one which is shown here. So, first you have these cauliflowering mushroom clouds, then you have the funnel. Here you can see a different picture of the same situation, this time taken from below. On the right you can see a reference picture of a nuclear test, Nancy, and you have the mushroom cloud climbing to a height of 1,300 meters or 1,500 meters. This small tower did vanish in the base surge, 300 meters in height. Here you see 200 meters. All this is a rough estimation based on the height of the surrounding buildings. Here you can see the nuclear weapon test Nancy. You see the stem formation of the main cloud standing firmly above the cauldron with the boiling rocks underneath, as well as the characteristic second bulb.
Schwerkraft und Kernkrieg kann da schon mal nicht die Ursache sein.
No. And inevitably there's a growing suspicion. You did not really by chance carry out a nuclear field experiment on the civilian population? A suspicion which seems not too far-fetched, especially when analyzing the current political situation. If you are planning a Third World War, then you have to know how to deal with radioactivity in a densely populated area and what kind of medicine you have to provide to the suffering civilian population. These people are planning things on a different scale. Their goal is global control. They do not care about a few 100,000 people who die of radiation sickness. Concerning the persistent hot chambers underground, the shots taken by a satellite are showing one very interesting feature. The building's center is thermally not very active, which seems strange at first. Also, on this picture you see that the center of the building spaces, 7, 1 and 2, does not store the entire thermal energy. However, this makes sense when you suppose that we witness here the formation of a cavity or several caverns. You have to understand that if you detonate a nuclear device underground without giving the possibility to depressurize, what will happen to the explosion's energy in the rock bed? The rock bed can't be compressed. It cannot disappear. The only thing that can happen is the formation of a liquid rock bladder under high pressure, which stores the energy of the explosion. So, as a result, you have this magma chamber, this bomb created, so to speak. I mean, a secondary bomb which contains the secondary energy, not the full energy of the first explosion, but a part of it. The ground itself stores this secondary energy, and this magma chamber wants to burst open. And if it does empty itself, you will have the fountain effects in the cavity created. And an empty cavity is not good for storing heat, simply because it is filled with nothing more but air. Well, and I really got sick after seeing these photos. These are vitrified, formerly liquefied rock structures inside the cavity. These are situated in New York, and you see these glass-like structures of formerly molten rock in the melting pot. The rocks were boiling. The workers, shown on these pictures, most likely got significant doses of radioactive radiation. This means that they contracted cancer with high probability later. With this, we have already collected a considerable amount of pieces of evidence. And while reviewing this evidence, I felt somewhat sick. On the other hand, I also got angry. Because you have to understand what the perpetrators finally did to the firefighters. First, they created an event using these airplanes, and the first responders rushed into the towers. When the firefighters were inside the towers, a nuclear weapon was detonated directly underneath the building. After the collapse of the towers, they ordered the first responders into the area without adequate protection and without the warning that the area was contaminated, so that a medical study could be carried out. Then, Congress at first blocked a bill which would pay for all of the healthcare costs of these first responders. Finally, they passed a bill which would pay for some of the healthcare costs, but specifically excluding cancer from the bill. And only in the year 2011, and because of public pressure, President Obama signed the so-called Zadrogo Act, which finally covers some of the healthcare costs of the first responders who suffer from cancer. So, the despise for human life in all this planning can hardly be topped. It would not be exaggerated to call this satanic.
So the cancer don't kill me, the pneumonia is going to kill me. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here to let everybody know that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people just like me that went down there as a patriot to our country and not caring about our own health or our own goodwill, thinking that the government would take care of us. And people just like me sitting, look at all these pills I take now. My life is all about medicine. I go to the doctors 2 or 3 times a month. I see 4 different doctors a month now, where I never saw anyone. I never even had a physician before 9/11. Never. I never was in this for myself. I hope to God that it is. And I'm not selfish in this. I'm only 50 years old. There's not a chance in hell that I'm ever going to work again with as sick as I am. So the compensation is not just for me. The compensation is for my family. I brought this stuff back to my house. What about my kids? What about the other responders' kids? If I had all that toxicity on me and I wound up with cancer 8-10 years later, did I get my kids sick?
If you detonate a nuclear device in a shallow underground, a very small one in this case with 1 kiloton yield, and at 20 meters below the surface, you will get an impulse response. Impulse response is easily explained. You take a ball, throw it underground, and it comes back. This is the impulse response. You can also trigger an energetic event underground. You hit the ground, and the ground hits back. Then the surface will burst open. As a result, you will first see a needle-shaped soliton. So this is the result of 1 million kilograms, 1 kiloton. Here you can clearly see the impulse response followed by a wavefront or crest, this fountain-shaped structure. Then the entire formation seems to be stable for a few moments. But then you will see, after the impulse energy has been fully released, the rising hot cloud from the extremely hot center below. Well, in this case it did rise to 1 kilometer in height. But one thing you can observe also are the bystanders, the seemingly uninvolved spectators who are watching the event with interest. Of course, they do receive a modest dose of radioactive radiation during this experiment, but they do not die. They certainly do have a slightly elevated risk in contracting cancer. I would not have chosen to take part in this, but none of these persons suffer directly in the immediate aftermath of the acute radiation syndromes. Now, let's see how we can produce just 1 neutron radiation pulse. Let's start with a simple experiment. We take a device, place it underground, then sealing the shaft, and finally detonating it. In this case, as I said before, only a chamber of liquid rock will be created. And pressure cannot escape from this chamber. We just have a highly pressurized chamber of liquid rock. Now, let's make a thought experiment. We leave a small shaft open, leading to the device. In this case, directly after explosion, a short neutron impulse will escape upwards through this shaft before the shaft is sealed by the liquefied rock chamber. Of course, the liquid rock chamber will rise a bit and try and depressurize. In case of a small shaft, however, the liquid will soon cool down and create a plug, closing everything else in. As a result, you have a weapon, at least hypothetically, by which you can trigger 1 single short neutron pulse out of the ground. eventually you can use this tiny fraction of neutron radiation which will escape the Earth. Next, we have another explosion, Sedan, which was placed 10 times lower at 200 meters. Consequently, yield is increased by 100 times, simply because the energy of the explosion is distributed on a spherical surface, meaning the square of the radius. So, if you have 10 times the depth, yield must be increased by 100 times. This video clip is unfortunately very much out of focus at first.
Sedan was detonated at 10 a.m., July 6, 1962. This is a view taken from the top of a 1,500-foot tower, located 6 miles from ground zero. These sequences are being shown at about 1/3 normal speed. The base surge, seen forming here, continued to grow until it covered an area about 5 miles in diameter. The main cloud rose to a height of 12,000 feet above the desert floor. The dome rose to a height of 290 feet before it vented at 3 seconds. This long view gives a better picture of the mass of material moved by the explosion and the early stages of cloud formation.
If you examine the energetic phenomena in New York, you can try to estimate how deep the device was buried. It was certainly placed higher than in the case of Sedan, thus not 200 meters. And it was certainly placed deeper than in the case of ESS Teapot, that deeper than 20 meters. And accordingly, you can try to estimate the real depth of detonation. Well, however, for having all this worked as planned, some preparations are required. What we did observe, after the buildings had been opened on top at 300 meters, were multiple and time-delayed explosions. We know the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth always refer to these small but multiple explosions, and they assume that one big final explosion, using the incendiary Thermite, did bring the towers down. If you look at the scheme of events from the nuclear point of view, then you have to prepare the building. This means you need an area where pressure equalization can take place in a height of 350 meters. This is like opening a chimney. Further, in order to create this nuclear chimney, you need to connect the elevator shafts. These were not connected at the beginning of the operation. And if you want to achieve such a destruction pattern as the towers did show, you need these preparations. Well, if you hadn't had this chimney created, there would have been the possibility that the tower would break at its base, topple over and simply fall. But if you permit pressure equalization at this point on top, at this point where the parabola changes direction, then the outshooting material will rip the embrittled and weakened steel structure apart from top to bottom. This means we had a system which used various components simultaneously. Where these classical explosions, we had the radiation pulse out of the ground, a neutron radiation flash, and we had the discharges of eruptive material which finally tore the towers down. In this context, I developed the physical model showing here. Here we have the device directly after the explosion. At this point, here you have a collimator. You may call it also a moderator if you like. It's just something which adapts neutrons to our needs. You have the neutron flash inside the tower, which is responsible for the sudden embrittlement of the steel. Thus, partly the steel will evaporate, partly will suffer extreme embrittlement. And if the entire building, in the course of 1 hour, suffered several explosions, then this embrittlement can be defined as the second step to destruction. So you have first the classical destructions, using thermite and other explosives. You have second, the embrittlement of the steel directly after detonation of the device. And last, 10 seconds after the detonation, you have the final eruption which destroys the tower in the third step. Here you see a picture of a nuclear field experiment showing such a collimator for neutron radiation. In principle, this is only an aperture plate. Generally, neutron radiation, especially fast neutron radiation, virtually passes everything without resistance. So they use 6 huge blocks of concrete in succession, hoping that each of these blocks, well, let's estimate 1 meter thick each, will block some part of the radiation. However, at the point where you have these holes in these aperture plates, the neutron will pass through. So after 6 plates, you will get a focused or at least an aligned particle beam, where all other directions and transverse components are missing. To allow you to compare this, here's an example on a small scale. If you want to align a particle beam, you use a collimator which will block all particles which do not have the desired orientation or direction. An additional effect is, during the second step of destruction, that the center of explosion and the shaft is being sealed off. People always ask themselves, why didn't I hear anything? You see, in the center of explosion, you have a temperature of 1 million degrees Celsius approximately. The neutrons liberated during explosions do have a mean speed of 22,000 kilometers per second. As a result, they are already inside the tower well before the sound has the possibility to get out of the shaft. Thus, the liquefied rock destroys and seals off the shaft, as well as it compensates for a few seconds the initial pressure of the main blast. Inside the tower, however, you get an interaction of a different sort of radiation. Because after neutrons entered the tower, they are immediately scattered by ion. As a result of this bombardment of the crystal structures of iron are destroyed, dissolved, iron becomes brittle, and at the same time different types of radiation are generated. Bremsstrahlung, gamma radiation, X-ray radiation, microwave radiation. All this transforms the tower for a short time into a sort of antenna. Further, we found that molecular dissociation of the steel took place as the radiation thus destroyed the lattice structure of the iron crystal, and consequently the steel was transformed to dust. Yes, the steel, it was dustified.
Ja, aber der Stahl wurde ja immerhin noch gefunden nach den Trümmern. Es müsste eigentlich ein Haufen von 30 Meter Höhe sein, aber man hat nur unten irgendwo am Boden das.
You must not make the mistake to conceive the incident as something which acts like a tsunami, that you have an area which is completely flooded and up there everything is dry. Scattered particle radiation does not act this way. You will rather have the characteristics of a machine gun firing micro bullets. You have a statistical average by which the radiation takes effect, but you cannot say which part of the steel girder will be destroyed.
Stahl dann gefunden ist, wird im Staub oder wo ist er dann?
Ja, der hat sich einmal
Ja, irgendwo muss er dann ja sein, der Stahl. Verschwinden kann er ja nicht. Ist er im Staub oder ist er in den Trümmern?
Well, there are first these iron droplets. These were formed out of the evaporated steel. And on the other side, you have steel dust. This is the steel which got a radiation impulse, which did not lead to the evaporation of the steel, but which led to the breakup of the steel structure, so to speak. You really have to imagine a simple picture. You take a hammer and a sheet of paper. You strike this sheet of paper with this hammer. the sheet of paper stays intact. You repeat this with a pane of glass. The pane of glass will break. Of course, in case of a steel plate, as it is ductile and is moldable, you have to use a very, very fast hammer, a sort of high-energy hammer. And the neutron-induced radiation just acts that way, that it can destroy the atomic structure of iron. The USGS did only perform the analysis of the present elements. Correctly, exactly this. Yes, totally correct. The dust which was simply carried away is very, very precious. It should be analyzed. Our lot is visible in plain sight. Even taking fire and all the other conditions into account, there are photographs of pieces which clearly show that the steel became brittle. This is a classical problem in nuclear reactors. The steel becomes brittle after some time. Well, and finally, this magma chamber is formed. This is a high-pressured bladder of liquefied rock which acts like an erupting volcano. And I'm just playing this video clip of a volcano eruption. Here you see a classical volcano eruption, nothing special. Without someone's assistance, the magma chamber explodes, pyroclastic clouds are formed horizontally, and out of the chamber a hot cloud is rising. This is how a volcano eruption looks like, if a corresponding energy is present inside the magma chamber. And now we compare this. This is a selection of various video clips. It starts with the South Tower's eruption. Compare this with the geyser and its bass howl. First, you will hear the bass howl of the geyser, and just imagine how hot gases are shooting upwards. The required size of the eruption channel must be approximately 10 meters by 10 meters. Then you will see the eruption of gases from underground. Then you will see the events at Tower 1 and finally the events at Building 7.
Out. I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
7 World Trade Center just collapsed. Look at this. Unbelievable.
Watching all day. This is like watching the collapse of an active volcano. And the dust from it is not unlike that from a volcano. We are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant.
It does appear that building number 7 has just collapsed. We've been telling you that that building was on fire. Building number 7 at the trade complex has now apparently collapsed. We also have reports that building number 5 might be on fire too, but now a huge amount of smoke and debris now up in that area again because of this building number 7 going down.
So, this is the artificial volcano eruption in New York. And after a while, one is wondering, where the hell is the radioactivity? And the first evidence I got is, of course, a very depressing one, namely the rising number of cancer victims in all this. But before we will examine this, still one note. I saw the video several times, and suddenly I noticed something which I did oversee for a long time, namely the scintillation of the cameras. If you are engulfed into a radioactive cloud, your camera will start to fail. This means it suddenly starts to register strange dots and green lines. And those people who are really caught inside a cloud had strange phenomena in their cameras.
That's the point where the camera went down.
Exactly, that's the point where the camera went down. Scintillation. The phenomena is called scintillation. When a radioactive particle passes through a thin layer of material, it produces these light emissions.
Also Indiz für die radioaktive Strahlung. Also es gibt da zum Beispiel so Handy-Apps zur Messung von Radioaktivität. Und die nutzen die Kamera vom Handy, um die Strahlenimpulse zu zählen.
I would like to give you some instructions for our radioactivity counter. The first step after starting, you have to cover the lens, and now we get the measurements. I test now with our small probe here, and there we can see the dots, and we get also a micrograde per hour value, which is valid after 1 minute, but I don't want to take this probe here so long. Now we go to the Buchler-Anlage, where we have more possibilities for higher radiation, and now we start with a high radiation. I just wanted to test it, what happens with the phones when I'm using 10 sievert per hour. This is a really dangerous rate. 1/2 an hour here before this device, and you are dead with 50% within the next week.
So by this you can measure the everyday natural background radiation. And after finding this, I was of course surprised, and I started looking for other video clips if they showed similar phenomena. And there were indeed some, very few however, which showed these phenomena.
Es gibt mehrere und einige zeigen dieses Phänomen, andere zeigen es nicht, oder es gibt nur so wenige?
There are too few clips available, as only a few people were indeed captured inside the dust cloud and continued filming. To my great surprise, I did find one shared clip with exactly this situation, but at the critical point all gets just black. So they did not cut it out. I don't know, perhaps they thought this is not interesting because nothing can be seen anyway. At least I found it obvious. Then I did some research. At the moment we have this situation. More than 2,000 people dead due to 9/11 diseases, more than 5,400 people sick with cancer, more than 37,000 people seriously sick, and more than 72,000 people receive medical care. And then I drew a hypothetical map of a possible radiation distribution. I mean, every person can suffer a certain amount of radiation before really noticing it. Normally, we do not perceive radioactive radiation. This room could be highly radioactive, we wouldn't notice. I mean, we wouldn't notice at first, only sometime later. And indeed, it is possible to calculate a radiation contamination which would have been possible that day, without the first responders noticing that they are under heavy radiation exposure. However, these radiation values must decrease rapidly within a few days. Only by a constant exposure to low levels of radiation, destructive ionization can take effect over a long period of time and finally cause cancer.
Nur akkumuliert so wirkt, dass sie Krebs bekommen.
Coming to the next point, EMP and isotopes. There is a scientist, Dr. Judy Wood, who formulated the idea that very exotic radiation weaponry might have been used, as quite strange phenomena had been observed, such as the sudden inflammation of cars. And one cannot explain why, when using classical explosives to bring a building down, why suddenly the cars around do go up in flames. Exactly, the paper does not burn, but the cars go up in flames. Exactly, these are the effects of additional radiation, as I told. The paper cannot absorb the energy, but metal can absorb this energy. And consequently, she drew a very, very bold conclusion and said that radiation weaponry does exist, where you can focus the radiation energy at any desired target. I don't want to disappoint all those who support and like these ideas, and thus I say that Dr. Judy Wood is right. However, the tower itself is this weapon. This means that the tower itself forms this antenna array. Its source of energy is the radiation flux from below the Earth, and thus the tower is capable of storing for a few seconds the radiation energy. In fact, it forms a Faraday cage. And when this Faraday cage suddenly breaks up in the moment the fountain is formed, then the radiation energy is also released, which causes the secondary EMP impulse, by which the cars do inflame. In short, we have the tower. You have the neutron flash inside the tower. You have the tower as a Faraday cage and as an antenna array. And at the same time, the particle flux is orientated strictly vertically, so that indeed even people in the towers could survive the flash. This I did not believe at first. They survived the neutron flash being quite close to it. Here at this point, the neutron flash passed nearby and they survived, simply because they weren't touched by it. This graphic shows the fission products of uranium. The maxima show strontium and barium. Well, if you like, you can compare nuclear fission to wood chopping. If you chop wood with an axe, each piece is slightly different, and you can draw a statistical distribution pattern as well. If you get a particularly big half up there, then you will have a particularly small half down here. Period. No option. And shown here is simply a statistical distribution pattern showing the expected sizes of the fission products. This means you expect this distribution in respect to a given standard. Each of these small dots is called an isotope. This is an isotope, this is another isotope, which means one element with a slightly different atomic weight. And these isotopes are radioactive, each one to a different degree. And in relation to this distribution map, you have a clear expectancy of the radioactivity which corresponds to this map. And now the crucial word, under laboratory conditions. This means if you detonate a fission bomb high up in the atmosphere, you will get indeed this distribution as shown here. But if you detonate such a bomb underground, things are different. Let's suppose we are at a fraction of 1/1,000,000th of a second, then you get a small fireball at 1,000,000 degrees Celsius. The neutron radiation will escape upwards without being hindered into the tower. And the rest will be within the rock bed, where it will be scattered back. This means the isotopes of our nice classical distribution map will be hit again by a neutron bombardment, which will eventually cause a shift in the distribution of the fission products. So, if you're trying hard and searching for strontium-90, which you do expect with a certain probability, it might well be that you are searching in vain. As in the case of a secondary neutron impact, the expected strontium-90 will turn into strontium-91. It simply absorbs under neutron, but by doing so it gets much more radioactive. This means it will decay much faster. It no longer has the expected half-life of 30 years, but only 7 days. Consequently, if you are able to influence this whole process in a way that you get highly radioactive isotopes, then you will have a few weeks of high levels of radiation in the center of explosion, and after a few years or months already, tolerable values. The same does apply for barium, of course.
Trotzdem, ich glaube, Herr Pommer, Sie hätten also mit Sicherheit ein Spektrum von Isotopen, die immer noch strahlen würden. Und ich stimme dem Andreas zu, man hätte mit Sicherheit in den ersten Wochen nachgewiesen, dass da für die Arbeiter und so weiter, auch die Chinesen, die den Stahl genommen haben und so weiter, da hätte man mit Sicherheit nachgeprüft, ob es nicht tatsächlich zu gefährlich ist, die Leute dort arbeiten zu lassen. Und dann will ich noch mal nachschießen. Also ich glaube, Sie sind Physiker, ich bin Chemiker. Also das Nanothermit, den in, sagen wir mal, 10 Tonnen auf Level, das war B1 oder B2, wo die Leute die Explosion gehört haben, den dort zu zünden, da wo die Stahlträger sind, um jeden Stahlträger, sagen wir mal, 20 Kilo von dem Zeug zu machen, dann kommt das Ganze genauso runter, wie es diese pyroklastischen Dinge zeigen. Es ist nicht nötig, was anderes anzunehmen als Nanothermit gezündet, natürlich wirklich. Da kriegen Sie Temperaturen von 1 Million Grad, wenn Sie das im Millisekundenbereich mit 10 Tonnen Nanothermit machen. Dann haben Sie alles, was Sie brauchen, um das Ding so runterzulassen.
The thing which also surprised me in this context was that at this time there was a constant bombardment of the population of New York with warnings of a dirty bomb terror attack. I think this started in 2005, but I may be mistaken. The whole thing was called the Ring of Protection, which was a large-scale operation in order to warn the people in respect to a nuclear terror attack. And people got crazy by hearing these constant warnings. The authorities even considered a ban against radioactivity counters, for civilians, because too many false alarms were reported. False alarms are possible. If someone did just leave the hospital after a thyroid treatment, then this counter will also go off, because it does register the radioactive counts. So, there was a time when the population was driven mad. Terrorists want to detonate a radioactive bomb, meaning a dirty bomb. And there are various video recordings available.
One can imagine an enormous amount of disruption even if a very small dirty bomb were detonated.
Walk around the city or drive around the suburbs, there's a good chance you'll be screened by a dirty bomb detector. It's a near-invisible, intense effort to fight terror. CBS 2's Tony Aiello gives us an exclusive look inside the ring of protection against dirty bombs.
In the city that never sleeps, it's the terror threat that keeps some up at night.
We have to think the unthinkable. And I think it's more a question of when than whether we'll have one.
The man just said something very important. He said it's rather a question of when. He doesn't have any doubts that there indeed will be a dirty bomb. I think it's more a question of when than whether we will have one. This means that the population was prepared. Hey, you will get problems with radiation. And there was a second and very interesting issue. I think it was in 2007. Yes, in 2007, there was a steam pipe explosion in New York and the FBI rushed in wearing full protection suits against ABC weapons. And one might ask why the authorities are so troubled by a broken steam pipe. In respect to neutron radiation, this is quite important. Well, indeed I had a headache for 3 months because the radioactivity was not as high as expected at first. I wanted to find more radioactivity, or I needed more radioactivity before making this bold step and declaring, well, this was a nuclear process, or at least an additional nuclear component. And suddenly I stumbled across an article which stated that first iron does form mostly stable isotopes. This means normally when a nuclear bomb explodes in the Nevada desert, the sand, the silicon, will absorb neutrons and will become radioactive. Iron can absorb more neutrons than other elements and not become radioactive. As a result, you can search with your Geiger counter as long as you wish. It will stay silent. That's my first point. These steel structures, iron has a certain stability. Even if you have new isotopes, they might not be radioactive. Consequently, you have to check the remaining steel if iron isotope 57 and iron isotope 58 are present. Iron 56 is the main component of iron, so just look for isotope 57 and isotope 58. Don't use your Geiger counter. And the second point, which I noted very, very late, iron scatters. You know the argument. Neutron radiation transmits its energy to water. This means all living things are destroyed, are killed by neutron radiation. And you know that it does not interact with building structures, brick buildings and so on. However, this is only partly correct. The key question is always, what will absorb the energy? And if neutrons scatter on iron better than on water, then you have, especially for iron, an absolutely devastating effect of neutron radiation. Here you see the cross-sections of some materials, iron among them. And especially fast neutrons, as they are produced during nuclear fission explosions, do scatter much more efficiently at iron 56 as on hydrogen. The factor is somewhat lower for thermal neutrons, These are present, for example, in a nuclear reactor. So usually use water in nuclear reactors in order to slow the neutrons down, as they can interact with it. And as you can see, iron has just outstanding values. This means you have an element with excellent neutron scattering capabilities and a low probability to transform itself into another isotope, and even if it does, it will turn radioactive only after absorbing the third neutron. This is the explanation, in my opinion, that you can have iron microdroplets in the iron dust and no signal is detectable by the Geiger counter. But if you go down into the rock bed, there you have the radiation present, because the rock will absorb the neutron radiation, and if absorption takes place, new isotopes are generated, and they will decay, emitting radioactive radiation. That's why they place the water basins on top, exactly. Well, it started with a snappy remark by William Tahil that in fact the tribute in light, which they are so proud of, has in reality the same wavelength as Cherenkov radiation inside a nuclear reactor. It's just if it rains on the radioactive 9/11 site, there would be a soft bluish glimmer in early 2002. I don't know if they really choose to play this game, but it is striking to see the similarities to the wavelength of the Cherenkov radiation. And of course, we can suppose, at least I do argue on the assumption, that there is a residual radiation from below. And what we should do is to analyze the rock 20-30 meters below these basins. Here you can see an up-to-date shot on Google Maps. You see the memorial pools, and you see this pit in the middle, which has approximately the size of the eruption channel needed. And you can easily imagine how the hot gases shot upwards through this channel, even with the structure still standing, which in fact did stand firmly for about 10 seconds until it was destroyed from top down. So technically all this makes sense, but it is a technique which is based on a very, very subtle interaction of various processes. You also have to prepare the channel underground to make it work. A few minutes ago, you asked the question concerning the bathtub. I actually did draw it here. If you design the entire layout in a way that the pressure wave fades here, the bathtub will be undamaged. Only at the outer circle it certainly will be within the sphere where neutron radiation is present. But if the main pressure wave fades already here, then you can explain why the bathtub's floor is still straight. In addition, the reported damage to the outer rim can be easily explained by the impulse response. If you had a soft material such as sand, the pressure would simply move these walls apart, pushing them outwards. If it is surrounded by very strong, non-flexible material as concrete or rock, the material will push back. But by this you can explain the bathtub's leaning walls in direction of the tower.
Beneath the Twin Towers lay what engineers called the Bathtub, a giant basement as big as 8 city blocks and more than 75 feet deep. It contained 7 levels of parking lots, maintenance offices, mechanical rooms, and the path, a commuter rail system running under the Hudson River from New Jersey. A 3-foot-thick concrete retaining wall called a slurry wall kept the Hudson River and groundwater from flooding into the basement. When the towers collapsed, most of the floors that had held the slurry wall in place were destroyed. Unsupported walls shifted. If they caved in, water would fill the bathtub and inundate the path and New York City's subways, flooding them for miles. When excavators dug below street level, they exposed sections of the slurry wall held up only by debris. Engineers searched for ways to remove debris without causing a catastrophic collapse. On the southern end of the site, near the ruined Vista Hotel, workers discovered a vast section of the slurry wall left totally unsupported.
The grappler operator, he said, Charlie, he goes, I don't think I should go out there. I said, what's the problem? He said, the ground is shaking. And I said, well, let's, back off. Let me get the engineering team down here immediately. We found that the slurry wall was moving just south of the Vista Hotel.
These walls are coming in. They moved in about 6 inches. And these walls hold back the river. So if these walls cave in, this place is going to get flooded out by the river.
There was sort of a valley sitting out in here between the wall and the South Tower. All of the collapse had gone down to track level.
These are shown here in red and orange color. This is the time scale. This is the moment when the first plane hit. They were able to seismically register the event. Shown here is the impact of a second plane, as well as the explosions which occurred a few seconds before the impact, as described by William Rodriguez for the North Tower.
Wobei das halt nicht den Einschlag des Flugzeugs. Also die seismischen Untersuchungen sagen ja, das ist eigentlich ein Wabelturm. Und wenn dort etwas reinfliegt, dann wird das absorbiert. Was man dort sieht, ist etwas anderes, das ist nämlich der Sprengsatz, der unten schon gezündet wurde zu dem Zeitpunkt. Ja. Und der ist, wenn man das exakt, die Flugdaten vom Flughafenspeicher vergleicht, mit den seismischen Wellen, ist er erfolgt, bevor das Flugzeug reinflog, ist praktisch diese Explosion erfolgt. Das heißt, seismisch hat ein Flugzeug, das oben reinfliegt, hat keine Auswirkung auf den Grund. Okay. Und das sieht man auch anhand der Wellen. Das heißt, die Bodenwellen, die Scherungswellen und so weiter sind eindeutig, weisen auf eine unterirdische Sprengung hin. Ja. Andere sind halt oberirdisch. Das heißt, wir haben 3 verschiedene Sprengungen. Ja, also die oben in den Türmen, wir haben die unten auf der Oberfläche und die unterirdischen.
Alright, correct. But the event is shown here as impact.
Als Ereignis Einschlag.
Ja, das wurde von Palisades wurde es so markiert.
Ja,
aber
ja, genau.
Die genaue Erforschung von den zwei, die es untersucht haben, sagen, die Zeiten sind nochmal eingestellt.
Perfect. There still exists a third corresponding shockwave from the destruction of Building 7, which has not been published, but has been registered.
Ich habe noch eine Frage. Wie ist es dann zu erklären, dass die Arbeiter, die da abräumen mussten, deren Gummistiefel wurden häufig hatten Probleme, sie wurden geschmolzen, die Hydraulikleitungen von Backern platzten, hatten sehr große Probleme. Und sie hatten ja bis zum Schluss, fast bis sie unten waren, im November oder Dezember, hat man noch glühendes Material gefunden. Glühendes Kies. Das kann man doch mit einem chemischen Ereignis nicht erklären.
Well, finally, in respect to cancer and the fast degrading rubber boots, you can explain it either way. And ultimately, I want to point this out. We have different groups, not only in the audience inside this room, but worldwide, who vehemently fight for some sort of views and exclude others. Of course, one can explain all cancer cases by the toxicity and the toxic fumes coming out of the ground. Of course, one can explain that the rubber boots were decomposed by aggressive substances and by the heat extremely fast. But it does not exclude the existence of an additional source of energy which causes cancer, or the embrittlement and the aging of rubber parts, and which leads to the bursting of hydraulic lines.
Es müsste ja im November immer noch sehr viel Energie aktiv freigesetzt werden dort unten.
Ja,
Jetzt könnte es nicht mehr glühen. Das wäre
Yes, first you have a scorching hot chamber deeply underground which stores a lot of heat. Then you have radioactive decay, radioactive processes down there. And then you have certainly residual energy from thermitic material as thermite. And it is this combination of components. I'm talking about the combination. I'm trying to design a model, a physical model which explains every observed issue. Thermite did play its part in this scheme. You could have brought the towers down just by using thermite. But in this case, you would have difficulties to explain certain radiation phenomena as the burning cars, especially to explain the inflammation of cars which were parked near wire-netted fences. Here you can see a few good pictures. The cars behind the wire-netted fence are quite shiny. The cars in front of the fence are roasted.
Andere Möglichkeit, die unter der Brücke Substanz, die vor der Brücke. Das heißt, wenn es einen Fallout von oben gab, durch die Partikel, dann ist etwas, was herabgeregnet ist.
Well, yes. Here you have the another picture, similar situation. Yes, this is taken from Judy Wood. So here you have the wire-netted fence with the roasted cars. The cars further away just suffered a bit. Well, if you have these energetic phenomena at a distance of 800 meters, well then...
Zerstörungen, die gingen häufig, hörten abrupt am Ende einer Türe auf. Also man kann das sehr gut mit Wirbelstrom, Induktionen von Wirbelströmen erklären.
I'm really trying to say nobody is mistaken. If there's a big group of people and I blame them for spreading nonsense, no, really, let's be thankful and highlight the important, valuable findings of all groups. Because finally, all we want is to contribute to the solution of this riddle.
Einig, dass es die Flugzeuge nicht waren.
Ja.
Hallo?
Da sollten wir uns beeinigen.
Genau, das ist immer das Gemeinsame, was war. Ne? Und dass die offizielle Geschichte nicht stimmen kann. Ne?
Und je höher.
Further, one of the arguments of the organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth is that there are no signs of acute radiation sickness. Well, there are video clips which do show soldiers who walk into the center of explosion in direction of the mushroom cloud. And, of course, they suffer somewhat from radiation. Nonetheless, the biological effectiveness does depend very much on the period of time, from the duration you actually stay within this contaminated area. I mean, what is indeed very, very harmful when you do live directly next to it? Let's assume that the event was radioactive, even very limited and with low levels of radiation. If you were living in New York at that time, near the World Trade Center, you very likely will have serious health problems. The real acute radiation syndrome, I mean loss of hair, shaking, vomiting and so forth, will be noticeable only after you got a radiation dose equivalent to the biological effectiveness of the seaweed, and this is indeed very, very much. But if we assume that an underground nuclear explosion took place by which you had only this neutron flash inside the tower, you could stay several days in this area without being seriously affected. This is the explanation why we did not observe this acute radiation sickness as sleep disorder, digestion problems and unexplainable pain and so forth.
Als ungewöhnlich empfunden werden, wenn man da Feuerwehrmann gewesen ist.
Ja.
We have some very sad news to report today about the loss of 3 true American heroes, Daniel Hegland, Howard Bischoff, and Robert Lever. According to the city's Department of Mental and Physical Hygiene, thousands of individuals, including rescue, recovery, and cleanup workers, and people who lived, worked, or went to school in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, have developed chronic and often co-occurring mental and physical health conditions. So a lot of people are unaware of this, but it's an epidemic of first responders and people who lived in the area who have developed debilitating diseases and chronic problems. One of the things that I keep coming across in articles about this, it's like Gulf War-like symptoms. Okay, constant fever, shakes, you're hot and cold at the same time, headaches, vomiting, debilitating pain. And remember, Congress at first blocked a bill which would pay for all of the health care costs of these heroes.
So you do right. In addition, the dust sample analysis done by the USGS does not confirm nuclear fission. The solid matter analysis shows levels of barium and strontium much too high to assume they could be the product of a nuclear fission reaction. This is correct, however. If you take a look at the leach table analysis, you will find not only the expected products of a fission process, but also the elements of the radioactive decay chain. Yes, the USGS is a governmental agency. And immediately, absolutely justified, it's not the first time that I am told this, be careful. Maybe this is a false trail.
So, einige Werte, wie zum Beispiel das Molybden, waren nicht offiziell veröffentlicht, sondern wurden nur erst aufgrund des Freedom of Information Act die Daten freigegeben. Das heißt, es gab eine erste Publikation, da gab es zwar Daten, aber es waren nicht alle Daten. Und weil man das für so komisch hielt, dass Molybden geschmolzen war, hat man das gar nicht mit aufgeführt. Das wurde also erst im Nachhinein.
Und molybdenischen Zeichen wofür?
Dass mindestens Temperaturen von 2600 Grad geherrscht haben.
What you are seeing here, well, you remember the chart showing the 2 fission products, barium and strontium, and me comparing it with wood chopping. This is enlargement of the chart. Up there is the peak of fission product probability. Correspondingly shown here is strontium, yttrium and zirconium. So the law of radioactive decay in this case is strontium, yttrium, zirconium, niobium. This is a beta decay, so the line goes just up like this until stability is reached. So we are looking at an uranium fission, and we know that strontium is the result of this fission process with high probability. And we know this strontium would decay into yttrium, then into zirconium and finally to niobium. What are we looking for when we know that strontium is present? We are looking for yttrium, zirconium and niobium. And finally the question is, are these elements present? Well, they are not only present, but they are even listed in close proximity to each other. This means, in addition to the expected fission products, strontium and barium, we have also the expected elements of the radioactive decay chain, listed by the USGS as a governmental agency. Well, and this is, as a matter of fact, a proof beyond any doubt.
Our goal is to figure out why it collapsed late in the afternoon on September 11, 2001, even though it was not hit by an airplane. The investigation conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology concluded
what we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
Our investigation will evaluate the probability that this was the cause of the collapse.
Well, yes, for those who doubt everything, there is the possibility that exactly these elements were stored as chemicals in their stable form in small marmalade pots inside the towers, but given the energetic phenomena we could observe, the cancer cases showing up, when we consider what is related to this event, namely the war in Iraq and the new anti-terror laws which we are confronted with in these days, then I tend to believe that the USGS data is correct in its current form. Nonetheless, be careful, it is a governmental agency, even they can make mistakes.
Von oben, ja.
Well, we have for barium and strontium the expected radioactive decay elements in the dust sample analysis. And of course, this is no coincidence that this data is being published. The concentration of these substances are low.
Also deshalb frage ich jetzt, was heißt es, das sind kleine Dosen? Also wie klein sind die Dosen im Vergleich zu etwas?
By using this formulation, I wanted to say the question is, does it make sense to publish these data or not? Does someone want to show us something, or do they not want to show it? These are very rare elements in extremely low concentrations. But if someone wants indeed to show us that these elements prove, or at least support, the theory of a fission decay process, then it absolutely makes sense to list them. And it is also very courageous to do so. Finally, I also have to build up a border in order to make a decision, always asking myself which sources are reliable, always being careful, and which are not, and how I am going to construct a reliable physical model, and where doubts do remain. I mean, if the USGS does present data which support my findings, then I will not try to dismantle them. If the NIST is claiming, well, the building was burning and all the steel melted and that's why the building came down, then we will doubt this.
Our take-home message today is that the reason for the collapse of World Trade Center 7 is no longer a mystery. World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
Dieser Stephen Jones ist ein sehr aktiver Verhinderer, dass man nur schon von Isotopen oder so spricht in diesem Zusammenhang. Also er ist irgendwie ein, wie sagt man dem,
What we need in the end is an analysis of the rock bed looking for isotopes, as well as an analysis of the remaining steel.
Man hat ja auch Uran 235 da sein, denn wenn ich eine Nuklearwaffe zünde, also wie man das gefasst hat, weiß, wie es ist, man muss diese kritische Masse erzeugen, man kann gewisse sag ich mal, Moderatoren nutzen, oder wir haben es ja vorhin gehabt mit dem Stahl, das geht am besten, damit kann man auch kritische Massen reduzieren. Dann wird aber nicht alles 235 umgesetzt. Also, und das hat eine Halbwertszeit immerhin von mehr als 400.000 Jahren. Ja, genau. Wir finden das. Wenn das da ist, ist es da.
Genau.
Und nicht natürlich, also man kann da gerade
well, yes, uranium has been found in the USGS dust sample analysis, but we have no checkmark noticing as the specific uranium isotope.
Das 238, 4,68 Milliarden Jahre, das ist auf jeden Fall da, wenn das damit vorhanden war. Aber wir reden ja von 235 als Isotop und das wird das spaltbare Material gewesen sein, wenn es eine Nuklearwaffe war. Dann wird sie in den Gesteinsboden enthalten sein, denn das wird nicht einmal.
Also würde ich gerne mal zusammenfassen, dass wir auf jeden Fall, weil ich muss jetzt langsam zum Abschluss kommen, ich muss nach Hause, für mich ist völlig klar, und das ist leider eben bei vielen Freunden und Bekannten eben immer noch nicht klar in der Mehrheit, dass es überhaupt gefällt war, dass es so nicht gewesen sein kann. Also dann, wenn wir als unabhängige Untersucher dann rangehen und sagen, es kann nicht so gewesen sein, dann ist einfach die Frage, wir haben verschiedene Phänomene und da sind wir jetzt von den Architekten und Ingenieuren auf der sicheren Seite und sagen, es waren auf jeden Fall kontrollierte Sprengungen. Um uns nicht irgendwelchen Angriffen auszusetzen, distanzieren wir uns von allen Theorien, die nicht unmittelbar belegbar sind, und dazu gehört auch die. Deshalb meine ich, ist es eher eine Vorsichtsmaßnahme, zu sagen, ja, wir haben damit nichts zu tun oder ich glaube da noch nicht dran, wie auch immer. Aber es ist völlig klar, dass selbst Gages Theorie oder auch so, was wir offiziell für gesichert gelten lassen, nicht ausreichend ist.
Yeah.
Es ist nicht hinreichend, um alle Phänomene zu erklären. Und deshalb glaube ich, es muss an Judy Wood was dran sein. Ich glaube, dass an deiner Theorie was dran sein muss, weil ich sonst die Phänomene nicht erklären kann. Nur in welchem Maße, was jetzt wie zusammenschwingt, das kann ich nicht sagen, das können wir auch offen lassen. Wir können auf jeden Fall sagen, wir brauchen uns darüber nicht zu streiten, wir müssen trotzdem nach außen hin gesamthaft auftreten und sagen, es war gefaked und glaubt doch diesen Lügenmärchen nicht. Und es war auf jeden Fall eine militärische Aktion, sonst könnte man nicht das bestgesicherte Gebäude der Welt so zum Explodieren bringen. Also es war auf jeden Fall eine militärische Organisation, die das veranstaltet hat. Und die haben einfach natürlich Mittel, die wir als Zivilisten nicht kennen können. Und dann können wir natürlich nur darüber diskutieren, was hat jetzt mehr Relevanz, mehr Glaubhaftigkeit und so weiter. Und in dem Zusammenhang kann ich nur sagen, ich fand das jetzt hochinteressant, was du da alles zusammengetragen hast und eine Riesenarbeit. Also ich glaube, das wäre jetzt zumindest mal ein Zwischenapplaus. Oder?
Thank you very much. Hereby I also do finish my presentation. On the internet there is an extended version of this topic. Just go to 911history.de and you have the continuation of the story, some additional flags finally, where I'm trying to show how the Mossad was involved in this operation. At which it doesn't stop there. I finally understood that this is a crime which has the characteristics of self-similarity. So to state that just the Mossad did it, or just the Israeli did it, or just the financial system did it, is not correct. Because in the end it is us who are giving the money to the financial system. This means if we shut up and do nothing against these crimes, then we are together part of the systems. And that's also one of my motivations. That's why I'm printing these cups, that's why I'm sometimes sending out these postcards inviting people to discussions which are pulled off in the last moment because the hotel's manager doesn't want me to present this at the location. So I'm doing these small exhibitions, handing out these cups and small flyers. Just take them home with you. I have enough material at home. I'm very glad I could present my point of view today, because normally I'm shown the exit door.
Diese Offenheit haben wir.
Und eigentlich haben wir mit dem Widerstand gegenüber der Mainstream-Meinung genug zu tun. Ich finde, es ist eben Teil dieser diabolischen Raffinesse, dass diejenigen, die erklären wollen, was wirklich geschah, sich entzweien, ob nun gewollt oder ungewollt, und dass wir elendiglich diskutieren über Opfer, Nicht-Opfer, Flugzeuge, Nicht-Flugzeuge, was auch immer. Und das ist ein Teil des Systems, und das müssen wir uns einfach, dessen müssen wir uns bewusst sein. Ich schließe mich da auf kleine Aussage. Genau, also kommen wir auf den kleinsten gemeinsamen Nenner. Und das andere, letztlich können wir nicht erklären, was ihm mehr ist, aber wir wissen, dass die Schaumkrönchen einfach alleine, was uns die Medien servieren, nicht genügen. Und was ihm mehr alles geschieht und geschehen ist, das können wir vielleicht letztlich gar nicht erklären.
Und dass sie kein Interesse daran haben, dass es geklärt wird, das ist doch